Hi, everybody. Welcome to the American Library in Paris. I'm Rachel Donadio. I'm the curator of public programs here, and it is a great honor and a pleasure, I have to stand in front of the mic, to welcome Sam Tanenhaus here this evening, best-selling author and former editor of the New York Times Book Review, where a few years ago he hired me. Tonight, he will be lecturing on his new acclaimed book, Buckley, The Life and the Revolution That Changed America. Sam is going to lecture here from the podium for about 45 minutes, and then we will open it up to questions from you in the audience, unless you decide to move things around. I'm going to introduce Sam now. Sam is the former editor of the New York Times Book Review and the author of the national bestsellers Whittaker Chambers, A Biography, which was a finalist for both the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize, and The Death of Conservatism. His feature articles and essays have appeared in The Atlantic, New Yorker, New York Times Magazine, New York Review of Books, Vanity Fair, and many other publications in the United States and abroad. His new book, Buckley, The Life and the Revolution That Changed America, was published to wide acclaim this year. So please join me in giving Sam a very big, warm welcome and round of applause.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Rachel, and Emma, who helped set all this up. It's really a great pleasure to be here. Kathy, my wife, and I have been in France now for almost 3 weeks. We spent the first night in Paris, and then we went to Bordeaux, Toulouse, Marseille, and with side trips to Aix and Arles, and we ended up in Avignon for a week, and now we're back in Paris. So it's really been a great kind of whirlwind for us. I'm assuming most of you know something. I'm just going to call him Bill Buckley, because everybody called him that, William F. Buckley Jr., including the people who worked in the mailroom at his magazine. Because one of the interesting things about Buckley is, although those of you who remember him think of him as a kind of patrician snob and rich guy, which he was very egalitarian in his personal dealings with all sorts of people, including me, when I first got to know him. And so I'll just call him Bill Buckley, and that makes it easier to distinguish him from his father, William F. Buckley Sr., who in some ways was a more interesting person than he was. One of my favorite reviews of this book was by a great writer, John Banville, some of you will know him, who reviewed it in the London Times. And when another critic, he wrote a note to another critic, I don't want to get too much in the weeds here, Mark Lilla at the New York Review of Books, about the book. And he said, well, I found the father more interesting than the son, and I wish the book had been about him. And Mark Lilla forwarded that note to me. And I wrote to Banville, and I said, I agree with you. The father is more interesting. So let me start a little bit with him, because that'll give you an idea of how Bill Buckley, who I think is universally acknowledged as the inventor and godfather of modern conservatism, the modern conservative movement. Let that all sink in for a few moments here, because we'll get to all of that. How he was really kind of an anomalous figure. For one thing, English was his third language. His first language was Spanish, which he was taught by the nursemaids and household help on the 47-acre estate he grew up in northwest corner of Connecticut. I don't know how many people here are familiar with Connecticut. Today we think of Connecticut as it's kind of a suburb of New York, particularly where hedge fund zillionaires live, and in Greenwich and places like that. Buckley grew up in a part of Connecticut that really was southern New England. It was a northwest corner, it was called, and it's right across the border from western Massachusetts to the north and Dutchess County to the west. Bill Buckley was born in 1925. He will turn 100. There's already a U.S. postage stamp to commemorate it in November. And one reason I mention his upbringing and the geography of it was that when Buckley, who was raised by his extremely conservative father, who'd been part of the counter-revolution that tried to overthrow the new government in Mexico in the early 1900s. When Bill Buckley grew up, taught by his father to hate Franklin Roosevelt was the guy who lived 30 miles west in Dutchess County and went to the same horse shows as the Buckleys in the summer. So it was very much a kind of upper-class internal war that dominated politics in that era. What made the Buckleys different was that they were not the patricians many thought they were. His father came from southern Texas, grew up really poor in the scrublands of South Texas, 100 miles from the Mexican border. That's why the Buckleys all spoke Spanish, because the father spoke Spanish as well as he spoke English. I saw references that said William F. Buckley Sr. spoke Spanish like a professor of Spanish literature in Madrid. That's how brilliant he was, how serious and literary he was, and he passed that on to his 10 children, of whom Bill Buckley was the sixth, the third son, and the sixth of 10 children. Grew up in this enormous estate. So his father's from the south of Texas. His mother was from New Orleans. Her name was Aloise Steiner. She came from middle to maybe up. We'll give her a little break here and say upper middle class, kind of commercial, commerce family, mercantile family in New Orleans. So a guy from South Texas who'd made his career in Mexican oil marries a belle from New Orleans. They're both devoutly, vehemently Catholic. But they raised their children in the heart of Protestant, right, Anglophile Connecticut. And that's where the Buckleys, who have all the trappings of wealth and a personal style, this enormous mansion with paintings they collected from all over the world. His father was an art collector. Those of you who think you might not be able to get through the 856 pages of my book, excluding the footnotes and bibliography, might just want to look at the letter the young Sylvia Plath wrote when she first went to the Buckley house for the debutante, the coming out party of her Smith housemate, Maureen Buckley. It's actually one of Plath's most famous letters, and this is before anybody knew who the Buckleys were. It was 1951, and Plath went. Those of you who are interested in her life know that she wrote these very long letters to her mother. And one of them is, this one is 4 or 5 pages long, and it's just about the amazing experience of encountering this family who lived like a kind of aesthetic royalty, you know, really closer to something you would see in France even than in England, just setting foot in this magical place. That is how Bill Buckley was raised. It's the world he knew. He had, as I said, 9 siblings, but there were also 15 to 20 people working on the estate. You know, these were the years when he was coming of age, when you would have 5 groomsmen mowing the lawns, chauffeuring the cars. And so that was his experience of what America was like in the midst of the Great Depression. So the idea that he developed of what America ought to be and should be and really was divergent, let's say, from what many other people experienced. So that made Bill Buckley. I'll add a little more about his father. His father came from the south of Texas, grew up poor. His own father had been the sheriff of Duval County. Are there any readers of Robert Caro's biographies of Lyndon Johnson here? Yeah, do you remember the one set in 1948 when landslide Lyndon stole the election for the Senate, and it was really a nomination battle, and all the votes were discovered in Duval County, Texas? That was the county where Bill Buckley's grandfather had once been sheriff. That's one reason Bill Buckley, and many who followed him ideologically do not trust American elections. So let that sink in a bit, too. Who think either the wrong people vote or votes are being falsely tabulated, all these things we would never imagine any American making an accusation about in our own time, right? So out of that background, Buckley was raised as a counter-revolutionary, a kind of internal enemy or adversary of his own country. And what he did was, because of his enormous talent, his intellectual and verbal talent, which was established young, he made it his mission, as someone who knew him very well once said, to try to restore America to the place that his parents would have understood. So I'm going to add one more piece about that just shortly. But Buckley's talent emerged in the first political campaign he was involved in when he was 15 years old, and America had its great debate in 1940 over whether to intervene in the Second World War. And the Buckley family, Bill Buckley and his siblings and his parents, were absolutely devoted, vehement, militant anti-interventionists, or as they proudly called themselves back then, isolationists. So one of the most important documents I found in my research was Bill Buckley's very first public speech. And some of you know, right? Maybe you saw him on Firing Line, the famous debate program, that he was one of the most accomplished debaters of his time and very much a public speaker. His first speech given in 1940 was in defense of Charles Lindbergh, the leader of the America First Committee. And it is like shockingly sophisticated and mature and brilliant. And you think, here is somebody whose views you have some problem with, but he's stating them so well, so eloquently, that his teachers saw he was destined for something really big. And he was. And his father saw this in Bill Buckley. Now imagine, though, if any of you come from a big family or even just a middle child. I'm a middle child, and with 3 children, then a 4th born later. The middle child is always the one who needs attention, right? The older ones are sort of off on their own, and they're looked at most closely by the parents, and the younger ones are coddled, and the ones in the middle try to draw attention to themselves. And that's what Bill Buckley spent his life doing. So I sometimes tell people, if Bill Buckley had not been so lonely and felt so overlooked, we would not have an American conservative movement, because what he needed was companionship and company, and he found the way to create it around himself through his own brilliance and the charismatic personality he had. And this reached a next point when he went to Yale University in 1946, after 2 years in the Army. So he was, although he was an isolationist, he never supported the Second World War, even when he was in uniform, and was not sent into combat, but he had important kind of jobs, we'll call them, in the stateside army. He was an officer's candidate school. He made it through that. He processed people who were, coming back at the end of the war, processed their papers, and so learned a little bit about bureaucracy, and also got exposed to people who were not of the same social class he was for the first time. And then he went to Yale, and Bill Buckley took Yale by storm. And I confidently, although maybe mistakenly, say Bill Buckley was the greatest campus journalist of the 20th century. And the evidence of this is that his very first book grew out of the editorials he wrote at the Yale Daily News. That book is called God and Man at Yale. It was published in 1951. Days after Sylvia Plath visited the Buckley families. estate. And that book remains, God and Man at Yale remains the most important book to come out of the American right then or since, because it galvanized a movement. And on the surface, it would seem to be just a routine topic. In fact, it's one we're used to because there have been many similar books written since. The book in which you accuse the professors of poisoning the minds of students by teaching them radical ideas. Buckley was the first one to write that book. And what made it important was that he was the biggest man on campus at Yale when he wrote it. He was the last man tapped for Skull and Bones. Some people here must know what Skull and Bones is, right? And do you get why being the last man tapped is the most important? Sometimes people ask me about that. Well, if he was such a big shot, these were the senior societies at Yale, as they were called. Yale, in its own way, thought of itself as a meritocracy. That is, once they set aside all the bigoted admissions policies, once you were admitted, you competed with everybody else, all the other guys, right? No women were admitted to Yale until 1969. And there were 15 or a dozen or 15 senior societies. Rachel knows Yale very well. She remembers those societies. And Skull and Bones was the biggest one. And to be the last man tapped is the biggest accolade. Why? I said the easiest comparison you can make is, if I'm really going to date myself here, if you go on the internet, as I did not long ago, and you want to see what the 10 greatest Van Morrison songs are, what do they? They always begin with number 10 and they end with number 1, right? So when it's a public ceremony, as the tap procedure was in those days, it was actually done in a courtyard with the other students looking on. And if you were audacious enough to think you might be tapped for one of these societies, then you gathered in the courtyard. Rachel, I think it was the Branford College courtyard, and then the current members, right, of the society would run through court and tap you, and then ask if you wanted to join the secret society. Well, the tension builds as you get closer and closer to the top men for Bones. So when you get down to the very end, and Bill Buckley, who's famous already for editing and writing very inflammatory editorials in the newspaper, isn't chosen yet, the drama rises. And then he was chosen. And so he was the big man on campus, and a year later he writes a book that says Yale is a hotbed of socialists and atheists. But what made the book successful was not the allegation. People have been saying that for a long time about Ivy League universities. Committees like the House Un-American Activities in Congress, right? Conservative, or the Hearst press, the very conservative press, have been attacking the Ivy League since the 1930s. Franklin Roosevelt was president, saying that the government was infested with communists who came out of the Ivy League. That's a very familiar thing to say. But nobody inside the Ivy League said it. That's what set Buckley apart. Buckley was not like a J.D. Vance or a Ted Cruz who thought he got snubbed at Yale or a Princeton and he's going to get back at his accusers. No, he was the star of his class. He was chosen to be the orator, the Class Day orator, as his son Christopher was. If any of you attended the gala talk Christopher gave, Christopher had a career at Yale that somewhat followed his father's without the controversy. And so this made Buckley kind of the focus of attention very early on. He was actually kind of famous before he left Yale. Sort of the way Hillary Clinton became famous when she was at Wesleyan, if you remember that. Gave a famous speech, a commencement day speech, and she ended up in Life magazine as a result of it, and arrived at the Yale Law School as a kind of celebrity when she was, barely 20 years old, 22 years old. Buckley was the same way, because Catholic intellectuals were following Buckley. They saw the line of argument he was making in this early period. So they were on to him. They knew he was someone to keep an eye on. Somebody who told me this by the way, and this will show you the complications and fascinating aspects of Buckley's life, was his most brilliant protege turned apostate. There were two of them. One, the best known of them, is a very good writer, Joan Didion, was discovered in the pages of National Review. And Joan, whom I knew very slightly, and Rachel knew even better because she wrote a long profile of Didion for the New York Times Book Review, and I edited it. Joan Didion pretended she'd had no history at Buckley's magazine, National Review. She very shrewdly erased that part of her history, though the essays are brilliant and worth reading. And even the new books coming out about Didion don't say enough about the early writing she did for the magazine. It was really quite elegant and superb. But the most promising of the proteges is a writer some of you will know, the great historian Gary Wills, the writer about Catholicism, politics, history. To my mind, a genius. And to Bill Buckley's mind, a genius. And those of you who have not read Gary Wills' first serious book on politics, Nixon Agonistes, read it now. Forget my book is okay, but read Nixon Agonistes. And Wills was the whisperer for my book. I admired him for many, many years. And I approached him. I got to know him. My wife, Kathy, and I both got to know Gary and his departed wife now, Natalie. Gary Wills is the only member of that literary generation, by the way, who's still alive. He read the galley of my book in 10 days. He's 90, and he read 100 pages a day and sent me detailed notes. So he was a guiding light for me in this book. If any of you have been following the reviews, a book like this is bound to be reviewed in many places, and you'll see some of the more ornery ones come from people who think I gave too much attention and credit to Gary Wills, because Wills became what Bill Buckley called the apostates. He had a great phrase. He said, National Review, his magazine, Buckley's magazine, founded in 1955 when he was 29 years old. He said it became a finishing school for apostates. And the apostates were Joan Didion, Gary Wills, John Leonard, great critic, one of my predecessors, New York Times Book Review. And they were attracted to Buckley because of his wit, his humor, his great personal warmth. One of my disappointments, look, this book has been very well received. I have no complaints about that. People tend to be nice to me. They're not so nice to Bill Buckley, because this is a moment when nobody really cares if you were kind of a nice guy. Personally, if you did stuff that they hold you accountable for. And I think we know why that is, and I'm happy to take questions about that. But I want to add one more piece about Buckley's background, and then maybe get into questions, if that makes sense. So I was working on this book for many years, and I got to know Buckley because he'd been kind of a gatekeeper and unlocker for me when I wrote a previous biography of Whittaker Chambers, who'd been this famous figure in the Cold War spy trials. And he was a hero of Buckley's. And I knew I was a much younger writer then, and nobody from nowhere. And I knew Buckley was someone who could help get me to some of the places and sources I needed to write that book. So I approached him. He was extremely generous to me for reasons I could never fathom, except that he thought this book should get written. And he didn't really care who I was. He didn't care what my politics were. He didn't care what my background was. He'd seen enough of letters I'd written him to think I was a good enough writer to do it. The most important thing was that I was serious about it. I wanted to get it done. Right? So Buckley had that ability, that capacity for drawing you in. And as I was working on a book, with the approval of Buckley himself, so I was given exclusive access to all his personal papers, including his personal diary, which is really just a calendar of the many, many appointments he kept. And his son, Christopher. Was the executor, and they wanted me to do this. They'd liked the biography of Whittaker Chambers. Well, Buckley's archive is at Yale University. Buckley was both a graphomaniac, right, somebody who writes constantly, and a pack rat. Buckley published 50 books in his lifetime. They included a dozen novels, half a dozen memoirs. He wrote 3 columns a week. Like those of you who like reading Ezra Klein or Jamel Bowie or David Brooks, whoever your columnist is, they're doing it once a week. Buckley did it 3 times a week, and it was syndicated in 360 newspapers back in the day when people got their news through newspapers. So this is Buckley at his peak, when he was not only the leader of the conservative movement in the United States, and that was a position he got through his great ability for talent spotting. Figures like Barry Goldwater and especially Ronald Reagan. Reagan was almost a kind of pupil of Buckley's until they have turned on him, which is one of the pieces of news I have in the book. So Buckley's archive was gigantic. Also, movement builders are responsive. Buckley at his peak received 600 letters a week and answered every single one. And those were the days, although he was, he loved technology. He was very early into email and its predecessors. For most of that time, that meant letters that were dictated to a secretary and typed. Sometimes the letter's 2 lines long, but the letter always got answered. That meant when I went through his archive, it was, and professional archivists have confirmed this for me, it's the size of a presidential archive, just the sheer volume of material in it. So I got lost in it. And at one point, my wife, Kathy, who's a professional researcher, made a very shrewd observation. And she said, you should not be writing the book out of just the one archive. And no matter how extensive it is, all the story won't be there. Why don't we look at the Buckley's family's second life, which I've not mentioned. And that was the thing I was kind of alluding to before, and then we'll get to questions. And because this is the big news in my book. It was a big discovery for me that I had to wrestle with as a biographer. And that is because Buckley's parents were both from the South, they never felt comfortable in Connecticut, especially his mother. Once the children were grown and out of the house, she felt quite lonely. She's a Catholic woman from New Orleans, surrounded by Protestant matrons. The kind who would have their calling card sent to your house with the corner folded down, which meant you don't need to bother calling on us. Right? That's the old, WASP aristocracy, which the Buckleys were not a part of. One reason Bill Buckley had that exaggerated patrician manner was to make up for that, for the thing he didn't really have. The other is that he grew up speaking 3 languages. I said the first was Spanish, the second was French. He learned it here when the family lived abroad, and the third was English. Well, the family, beginning in the late 1930s, Buckley and his siblings, when Bill Buckley was 13 years old, acquired a second home because his mother always wanted to go back to the South. So his father found for her an antebellum mansion in Camden, South Carolina. Anybody here know South Carolina? Yeah, it's near Columbia, right? It's not Charleston. They thought about moving to Charleston, but the father was going to buy a big house in the Battery. But he thought it were those beautiful old estates. But the price was higher than he wanted to pay. And also he wanted more grounds and property for his kids. Those 47 acres in Connecticut weren't enough. So they got this big antebellum mansion in Camden. And Kathy said, well, why don't we see what there might be there to learn about? Because when you write books like this, a lot of it is you do newspaper research. If you read Bob Caro's books, you'll see how often he's drawing on newspaper accounts from the time. They give you color, they give you little bits of information that get lost in the broader histories. Well, and I'd been stimulated to do this by one little detail I found in National Review. And briefly, National Review is the magazine Buckley founded in 1955 after the defeat and fall of his second political idol, Senator Joseph McCarthy. And Buckley saw with that shrewdness that McCarthy-like populism would be the future of the Republican Party, and let that one sink in too. Well, in the first pages, what they call it, the front of the book in the magazine of National Review, and Rachel pointed out to me, you actually have some archived issues of National Review in this library. The first items were unsigned editorials, news editorials, which are comments on the news. They were unsigned except if you had access, as I did, to what were called the master volumes. You know those bound volumes you have of the New Yorker here? There are bound volumes of National Review like that, and there's one master set, as they call it, original set, in the offices of National Review. And if you open the page, you see written in red pencil who was the author of each unsigned editorial. And there was one that made a reference to a racial incident in Camden, South Carolina. That something had happened that disturbed Bill Buckley, a racial incident. And so Kathy and I had the idea, we'll go down to Camden. They must have the archives of the Camden newspaper, and we'll see maybe what the story was. That's how you research 101. And then try to interview people if we can. So Christopher Buckley, Bill Buckley's son, said, well, if you go down to Camden, be sure to look at another Buckley family archive that had been assembled by the fourth. Bill Buckley was the third of four sons. The fourth youngest is named Reed Buckley, and he spent most of his life, adult life, in Camden, South Carolina. And he was quite close to Christopher. He was a novelist, aspiring novelist. And Christopher said, well, be sure to look at my Uncle Reed's archive. I don't know what's in there, but I'm sure there's interesting stuff. So I got in touch with the archivist at the library in Camden, South Carolina. Said, well, I'd like to look at the Reed Buckley material if I can, and then also look at the newspaper if you happen to have microfilm of the Camden Chronicle, because I knew that was a weekly newspaper. And she said, you mean the Camden News? And with this like obnoxious arrogance that people like me have, we think because we're writing the book, we know more than the people who live in the town. I said, no, the newspaper is the Camden Chronicle. And she said, well, yes, we have the Camden Chronicle, but there was a second newspaper that nobody's ever really looked at called the Camden News, and it was owned by the Buckley family. And you can see the documentation in Reed Buckley's archive. So, well, that's kind of interesting. File that away. Then we go down, and I go down to Camden. This was the spring of 2016. It was May 2016. So I remember I was behind the deadline for a Vanity Fair story. So I go down there, and we meet with the archivist, and she said, well, good news, I found somebody who actually, because I'd asked her if she could find anybody who had known the Buckley family all those years before. She said, well, we seem to have somebody here who was very close to the Buckleys and wrote these admiring letters about them after the family members were dying off one by one. She showed me the material. Man was named Edward Allen, and it was pretty clear that he was black. I thought, well, that's interesting. So we'll read about the Buckleys and black people in Camden, South Carolina. So we set up an interview with him. He came to a library, not as gorgeous as this one, but a nice public library in Camden. And we met with Edward Allen, who was then in his 80s and now in his 90s and still our friend. And he said, well, I have to tell you how fantastic the Buckleys were, how great they were. They were the first northern family. Wealthy families would spend the winter, they called them the winter colonists, a winter colony in Camden, because you didn't have to ride the train, which is how you got there, as far as you did to Florida. And also, if, like Buckley Sr., you needed to get back to New York and look at your oil empire and see how it was doing, you could get on the train and be there sooner. You could be there the next day. So the Buckleys, Edward Allen told us, brought an entirely new culture to Camden, South Carolina. Before then, when people came from the North, they would hire mainly black people, as all the rich people in the white South did, right? And then when the season was over, those people would be fired and they would look for their next job. Not with the Buckleys. Buckley Sr. made sure if he either brought some of the staff back with him. He's a Southerner. So he brought them back to Connecticut. And one of Buckley's friends who saw some of the black servants in their white tuxes and black ties at Stanford said it would take Tom Wolfe to describe what that scene was like when Buckley would bring his Yale friends back to Sharon, Connecticut, the town he grew up in. And Edward Allen said the Buckleys didn't do that. The Buckleys looked out for you. The Buckleys sent some of the children to what we now call historically black colleges and universities. They would pay the money for it. And I found more and more evidence of all these philanthropic things the Buckleys had done. So, well, that's interesting because National Review does not take that line on civil rights. So then it was time to look at the second newspaper. So we give me the microfilm. That's how it's, digitizing newspapers is really expensive. Digitizing all archives are. Unless they have a lot of money, the old ones are going to keep it on microfilm. So I started scrolling through the Camden News. The Camden Chronicle came out 2 days a week. And the Camden News came out 1 day a week. And to look, it started in March of 1956. So keep that date in mind. It's the peak period of what was called massive resistance to the Brown versus School Board decision in the South, when leading Southerners swore they would contest the Supreme Court's decision desegregating schools, challenge it any way they could, something that would never happen in our politics today. And so you read page 1, and it's about the Camden Horse Show. It's about the gardens and the flowers and the house tours and all this thing, right? It's the winter in Camden. And then I got to page 3. And page 3 is a full-page advertisement in the Camden News. And it has very bold, you can see it in the insert, the photo insert of my book. I reproduced that page. You can see in black type, it says, all white citizens of Kershaw County, of which Camden was a capital, are invited to join the White Citizens Council. Anybody know what the White Citizens Council was? It was a Ku Klux Klan, only they dressed like me, with ties. It was called the Uptown Klan. They were the ones who did not run around in crazy hoods and robes, and they didn't lynch people, and they didn't flog people, but they would say, we understand you donated some money to the NAACP. You may have some trouble getting a loan from my bank next time around, or we're going to have to look again at your mortgage. 3 black churches were burned to the ground in Camden, South Carolina in the space of a month. A white music teacher who had taught some classes at the all-black school of which the Buckleys were benefactors, whose most famous graduate, by the way, is Congressman James Clyburn. Remember him? The guy who got Joe Biden elected? Clyburn went to the Mather School, and the Buckleys were supporters of it. And real benefactors, including for Edward Allen's siblings who went to that school. Well, the incident that Buckley had written about in National Review was the case of a white music teacher who had taught some, and I'm going to just use the language of the day, okay, because that's what people did, who had taught Negro students at the Mather School. As a result of which, when he was driving home from a concert, he was in the Charlotte Symphony Orchestra in North Carolina, a Klansman had stopped his car, pulled him out, put a hood over his head, dragged him to a tree, and flogged him with an inch of his life. That was the editorial Buckley had one line about. And as far as I could tell, it was the only time he ever commented on violence in the South when he knew his entire family was surrounded by it. And with that, the entire story I was telling changed, because it came to be about what the American conservative movement was really built on. Prior to that, Buckley had been a great champion of Joe McCarthy, anti-communism, militant anti-communism, which often meant slanderous and accusatory anti-communism, not so different from his first book. McCarthy's demise in those famous hearings that we know about from the George Clooney film, the hearings which were seen by far more people than you would imagine on television. 20 million people watched the Army McCarthy hearings in 1954, at a time when far fewer households had television. That meant people were going to bars to watch them. At the same moment, McCarthy declined, really went into his tailspin, the Brown decision was issued. And that's where the movement found its new cause. So when I've spoken to professional historians, I am one in my own right, but I don't have a PhD, I don't teach at a university. They told me for them, the news in this book, the puzzle it solved, or the lock it springs open, is how you get from the politics of this kind of high, abstract defense of anti-communism to this politics of racial reaction in the South. And the answer is 2 words: Bill Buckley. He brought it all together in himself. So that became the story I now had to tell. And it meant not rewriting so much as rethinking. I tell people, as long though it took for me to write this book, it will sound ridiculous. I'm actually a pretty fast writer. I'm a really slow thinker. It takes me a long time to figure out what my subject is, and then I suddenly knew it. I saw, it was impossible not to see, that Buckley had been instrumental in reshaping the politics along these different lines, and he got it again from his father. I'll tell one little story about that, and then we'll go to questions. When Buckley was at Yale in 1948, there was an election going on, right? The famous one, right? Dewey defeats Truman. And everybody at Yale, very conservative, was pro-Dewey, and there were some who were for Truman. Of course, Truman won. Dewey defeats Truman was the mistaken headline. And there was a third candidate Buckley was really interested in, and he was the nominee of the Progressive Citizens of America, Henry Wallace. He had been Franklin Roosevelt's 3rd vice president, right? And in 1940, or 2nd vice president in 1940, Truman was the 3rd, and who was much more an accommodationist, what was called an appeaser, the Soviet Union in 1948. And Buckley kind of learned how to debate and stage political spectacles by going after Henry Wallace and his left-wing supporters at Yale. But there was a fourth candidate he paid no attention to. Anyone know? I mean, this is a ridiculous question. If anybody answers this correctly, you get the copy of the book for free. Anyone know who the fourth candidate for president was in 1948? Strom Thurmond. You get it. That's yours. That is yours. Right? The Dixiecrat Party. Right? And Strom Thurmond won 4 states. And one of them was South Carolina, which he carried in a landslide, including the Buckley's county, Kershaw County. So while Bill Buckley was running around chasing communists, his father, who was then in his late 50s, was meeting with some of the remnants of the old America First group and saying, you know, I think we can build an alliance between my friend Strom down here in South Carolina and conservative Republicans. And then Bill Buckley later got the message after Brown that that's where the votes would be. So that's part of the story the book tells. There are many other stories, but that's a key one. So now I think we should, right, that's enough of me yakking away? Or are there questions people want to ask? Or want to get into stuff?
Please raise your hand high.
Yeah, raise your hand. I think we're going to bring a microphone around. My wife, who used to run events much larger than this, told me once that you have to keep nattering away till the microphone holder finds the person. Right? We did it? Are we good, Alfonso? All right, man, we're good.
Kudos
Okay.
to Strom Thurmond. But thank you very much. Very interesting. Just maybe the guys, Bill Buckley's 30 years old. So how does he found a magazine? Where does he get the money? And kind of, and he's the star child of Yale. So why doesn't he go to Brown Brothers Harriman or someplace like that?
Yeah, those are really, really great questions. So I'll try to do it briefly. Most of the money came from his father. His father saw how talented the son was. And it happened again after the defense of McCarthy. Buckley's first book, as I was God and Man at Yale, his second bestseller was called McCarthy and His Enemies. The book is about this thick, and there's this much on McCarthy, and the rest is on the enemies. And who are the enemies? They're the elites, liberal establishment, a term National Review soon moves to invent, editorial boards at newspapers, Ivy League professors, all these people that no politician would ever criticize today. Well, Buckley knew he had his gold mine there, wanted to keep the movement alive, and so he looked for backers and funders and couldn't find many of them because this was Eisenhower's America. It's a pretty prosperous time. And if you're a business guy, you really don't have a lot of problems with what's going on in the U.S. So he had to find super ideological backers. And the main one was his father, who wrote him a check for $100,000, which was a lot of money back then. And that got him started. And Buckley made the rounds. He's charming. He's ingratiating. He's able to pull in bits in unexpected places. We now know, there have always been right-wingers in Hollywood that we kind of forget this. But some of us know John Wayne, for instance, or the actor Adolphe Menjou. They were right-wingers. Buckley would go out there. He got some money from them. And he scraped together just enough to start the magazine. Why was he not at Harriman Brothers? That's what makes Buckley interesting, right? Because people will say to me, other conservative journalists of his era would say to me, well, I could have done everything Bill Buckley did if I had as much money as he did. First of all, the family fortune was not nearly as large as everybody pretended. But the other thing is, the way I answer that is, yeah, there are a lot of people who had all the advantages Buckley did and didn't do a darn thing with them. Whereas he, for better and worse, created a magazine, started a movement, really thought he could transform the culture. And the reason he started a magazine, by the way, and this is Buckley's genius, was that he understood political debates were going to be cultural debates. And by that, I don't mean like finding wedge issues to drive people apart, which is what we mean by the culture wars today. What Buckley meant by it was, well, I have to publish a magazine that's better than the liberal magazines. I have to publish a magazine that's so well written, liberals think they need to read it, and maybe I'll change some minds. Or Buckley did Firing Line. The idea in Firing Line is he would bring a liberal onto the stage, and he'd out-argue them. And you didn't have to agree with Buckley, but for that hour, it was on PBS. Buckley was not a guy who wanted to defund PBS. You'd say, this guy's smarter than I am, and he's a better talker. Maybe I should listen to him. That was how Buckley started the movement. He started at kind of a high level culturally. Yeah, okay, how are we doing here, Alfonso? Wow.
Come in with one over here.
Oh, we've got another mic over here.
Yes.
All right.
Hello, thank you very much for the presentation. So, given what you just were telling us, there's prelude, and you mentioned only just a moment ago political debates and cultural debates. Can you talk about the debate with James Baldwin?
Yeah, that's everybody know about this. 1965, Cambridge University. Buckley and Baldwin have this famous debate, which you can see on YouTube, and it was Buckley's idea. All right, so Buckley was now 39 years old. Baldwin was just a few months older. He'd had his eye on on Baldwin for a long time. Everybody knew Baldwin was brilliant. Right, The Fire Next Time had been published, and it made this kind of shocking argument about the American dream and whether black Americans were included in it, and that was the issue that was put up for debate. And Baldwin was not particularly interested in Buckley. Buckley had been calling him names in his column for a long time. Not racial names, but kind of like Charlie Kirk-like names. He said this is the number one America hater in America is James Baldwin, this sort of thing. And Baldwin was on a book tour and agreed in England. He agreed to do it. And so they met at Cambridge University. And Buckley was unknown in England at the time, so he had to be introduced by the BBC moderator, whereas Baldwin was already world famous. And the way the Cambridge debate worked was that each of the two made a presentation, and then the other side, the students, left and right, whatever they called the parties, Labour and the Tory party, the Conservatives, would then go up and carry the debate on. But the featured speakers were Baldwin and Buckley. And Buckley had an idea something was coming up, because normally the way the debate works is it's done in a kind of high, formal, Oxbridge, right, Cambridge and Oxford style. So the two contestants, combatants, are seated next to each other at dinner. And Baldwin said, I don't want to do that. I don't want to sit next to him. And Buckley actually respected that. He liked the idea that if you're going to really tangle with somebody, tangle with them. He had no problem with that. So then they go to have the debate carried live by the BBC, and to everyone's surprise, the place is packed. They cannot fit them in. Normally a college debate, Buckley was a famous campus debater. He and his brother-in-law, Brent Bozell, his co-author on the McCarthy book, were champion debaters who had defeated English teams when they were in college. But he wasn't prepared for James Baldwin. So there's a room of 1,000 people. More wanted to watch it, so they had an overspill. They had outer rooms with TV screens so they could watch what was going on in the debate. And they start with Baldwin. And if you've seen this, Baldwin stands up. He doesn't look at Buckley, doesn't mention his name. The question was, does the American dream come at the expense of, again, I'm going to use the language of the day, used by Baldwin as well, of the American Negro? And Baldwin stood up and gave what we now understand to be a concise description, almost unheard of in its time, of systemic or structural racism, and explained how if you looked at the real cost of slavery, it went back to the founding of the country, and the capitalist economy had been built on it. And hardly anybody had heard this said before. And Buckley assumed, well, in England, they're not going to go for this. But he made two mistakes. One is that England was already, the British were having second thoughts about their own colonial history in Africa. So they'd become very sensitized to the idea that there was an inherent historical record of racism in these great Western nations. The other mistake Buckley made is there was this debate is in February of 1965. And if anybody remembers what was going on there in the Deep South, this is days before the March on Selma, led by Martin Luther King and others, the great John Lewis, the late and lamented John Lewis, who was beaten nearly to death on that march. And Buckley spoke as if none of this was happening in America. But here was the moment that did him in. After Baldwin spoke, there was this spontaneous eruption of applause. And the BBC moderator, right, his broadcast live, said and so you can hear him say it, said, I've never seen this before. The entire audience is rising as one to applaud, he says, this magnificent speech by James Baldwin. Buckley gets up, and he didn't know if he read a little more. Buckley was a guy who read not as much as he wanted you to think he had. If he'd read Baldwin's book a little more closely, he would have known Baldwin was a wunderkind preacher in Harlem when he was a child. He was a natural soapbox orator and sermonizer. And that's what held the audience rapt. It was Baldwin using this language we all know from his books, of kind of King James biblical language of exhortation and criticism. Buckley stood up and he said, well, in his book, Mr. Baldwin does not speak with the English accents he uses tonight. We essentially called him a minstrel. And like these shocked noises, you hear it on YouTube, this booing and hissing. People can't believe what he has just said. And Buckley had totally miscalculated, rare for him. And so he was defeated badly in that debate. And because there was a vote afterwards, and he lost it 3-1. And I realized, putting it in context, it's what you do in these books, is you create timelines, see what the sequences are. It was right after that debate that Buckley abandoned the book that was supposed to be his masterpiece on the meaning of conservatism in America, a book he was never able to complete. And you'll see that in the discussion of my book, you'll see where some writers talk about that, how Buckley never achieved what he should have as a thinker and writer, and I think it was partly because Baldwin caught him out in a moment that he didn't really adjust to. I'll add one thing quickly to that, however, which is that they debated a second time in New York a few months later. And Buckley handled himself much better there. It was on the old David Susskind show called Open End. David Susskind had a television interview program that was as long as Joe Rogan's podcast. It would go on for as long as 3 hours. And it was Baldwin and Buckley going back and forth. And then Buckley realized that his argument, which didn't work when he talked about the American South and blacks, worked better in the urban North when the racial stakes were different, when it had to do with things like the Great Migration, schools, jobs, neighborhoods. Then those racial antagonisms emerged in a clearer way, and as a result, Buckley decided to run for mayor of New York, a campaign he lost, but at the same time rescued the conservative movement and the Republican Party. It was after that campaign, which Buckley lost, that he went out to California and told his friend Ronald Reagan, he said, yeah, I think you should run for governor of California in the next election. Yeah,
So we have time for one more
Oh
question.
man, I've got to give shorter answers, right? I think I have so much to say. Yeah. All right.
Hi.
Yes.
Can you talk about in '68 the Republican convention, and it was similar to Baldwin and Gore, but this was ABC News was number 3 in the market.
No, you meant between similar to Buckley and Baldwin. This is Gore Vidal.
Gore Vidal and Buckley. What place did that put them both in? And was this an antagonism that lasted throughout their life?
Yeah, it was. Are people familiar with that from the film Best of Enemies? Some of you, if you've seen that. And for those of you, sometimes it gets said I was a producer of that film. I'm not. I'm just one of many kind of brainless talking heads, happy to be on camera, but I was not a producer of it. Yes, 1968, Republican convention was actually more hotly contested than people realized. So Lyndon Johnson in 1967 had said he was not going to seek re-election after he did badly in the New Hampshire primary. He won it, but not by enough. So it was actually the spring of 1968 that he decided not to run. And his challengers were both on the left, Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy. And the Republicans were having a battle of their own. And I have a fair amount on this in the book for those of you who are interested in political history, because Reagan, who'd been elected governor, had already emerged as the hero of the right wing in American politics. He was their most glamorous figure already, and he was not young. I mean, he was already in his late 50s. Can you imagine somebody that age thinking he could get elected president? And people were concerned about him. And so the mainstream choice was Richard Nixon. Nixon was the guy that nobody loved, but thought they couldn't deny the nomination. And Buckley had decided, even though he was the mentor to Reagan, that Reagan wasn't ready. He couldn't win an election yet because he'd seen what happened to a previous disciple, Barry Goldwater, in 1964. So he decides to back Nixon. Well, at the time, there were 2 conventions. One held the Republican convention in Miami, and the one we all hear about in Chicago later that summer. That's where, there was a riot, right? Police riot. Anybody know how many people were killed in the Chicago demonstrations in 1968? The protests during that? 0. People got their heads bashed in, but nobody was killed. There were people killed in Miami. There were black citizens who were killed by police, and there was a protest. The Republicans were smart enough to hold their convention in Miami Beach, across the causeway from Miami. Well, ABC News, which, as you say, was the third, right? My friend Frank Rich in this documentary says they were the budget rental of the big 3 networks, right? This is an era when there were only 3 major television networks, right? This is long before cable. This was the first presidential election broadcast in living color, as they called it, instead of black and white. That's how far back we're going. And the executives at ABC went to Buckley. ABC didn't have much money. They did not want to do gavel-to-gavel coverage, as CBS and NBC were doing. So they went to Buckley, who was already famous because of his mayoral campaign. And they said, well, we have an idea that we're going to have only 90 minutes of television coverage of the convention. We'll do it at night. It'll be our late night programming. We'll do a recap of what went on the convention floor, and then we'll have our reporters file stories. And then you and someone else, a liberal, will have a conversation about what's going on. And they said to Buckley, are there any liberals that you think would be good competition for you? He said, absolutely, my friends. John Kenneth Galbraith, he'd be really good. Norman Mailer, another friend of Buckley's. Buckley had many, many liberal friends. He found conservatives boring, and he found Republicans boring. So all his friends and sailing companions were liberals and left-wingers. So also there's my friend Allard Lowenstein, if anyone remembers him, the congressman who had essentially brought Lyndon Johnson down in the 1968 campaign. And so the executives shrewdly said to Bill Buckley, is there anyone you won't debate? And Buckley said, well, I will never share the stage with a communist because that gives them, that dignifies this outrageous position. I will never do that. He said, also, I kind of had a problem with Gore Vidal. We've debated before, and I wasn't happy with the result, and he lied about me, told untruths, one thing or another. So the ABC executives, right, go to the video, and they look at those days, there were kinescopes. They look at the few televised debates Buckley and Vidal had, and they realize this is just golden. These guys look alike. They sound alike. They've got the same kind of odd Alfred Lunt sort of Broadway accents, and they hate each other's guts. It's perfect. When my friend David Remnick, who's the editor of The New Yorker, read the manuscript, before he read the manuscript of my book, after he saw the Best of Enemies, he sent me a note and he just said, those voices, he'd seen Best of Enemies, just to hear these guys. Nobody speaks that way anymore. Well, Vidal went into that debate with an idea. He was absolutely convinced, and he was not alone in this, that Bill Buckley was gay, that he was secretly gay. And he wasn't coming clean about it. Now, the odd thing about that was Vidal was in the closet, too. Nobody, maybe Truman Capote would admit now here I am, sound like them, would speak about his sexuality in that way. Vidal did not. But he knew where the anxieties and the pressure points were. So from the beginning of what was a total of a dozen debates, 6 in Miami and 6 in Chicago, Gore Vidal was needling Buckley, making comments that would be interpreted by many people that Buckley was really gay. One of those people who interpreted it that way was Buckley's wife, Pat, who was a socialite in Manhattan and knew even more people than Buckley did. So when the great journalist Murray Kempton said to Pat Buckley, this is before the famous exchange I'm leading to that you want to hear about. Murray Kempton, who knew the Buckleys pretty well, said, well, Pat, how are things going? Just, how are things going? 150 million Americans think my husband is a screaming homosexual. Because that's how it was being interpreted in their social circle. And Vidal knows it. Remember how I mentioned before how when the Buckleys are going after the Roosevelts, they're going after kin of a type, neighbors, people who inhabit the same universe. Vidal and Buckley inhabited the same universe. They had many of the same friends. I found correspondence before this famous exchange where they addressed each other very cordially by their first names. But what Vidal wanted to do was to expose Buckley. So they moved from Miami. Well, and to give an example, in the very first debate, Buckley thinks he can go after Vidal by attacking him for his novel Myra Breckinridge. So I'm not going to make any more of these foolish free book offers to anyone. But I'll ask if anybody remembers that. Yeah, not you. If anybody remembers the novel Myra Breckinridge, I have to wrap it up. It's the first serious novel, literary novel about what a transsexual person was then called a transvestite who has a sex change, a shocking thing. And the character's name is Myra Breckinridge, and Buckley says to Vidal, well, here you say all these things terrible things about Republican, and their greed, which was Vidal's line of argument. Maybe the man who writes this salacious bestseller, Myra Breckinridge, shouldn't be lecturing other people on greed. See the same thing he did with Baldwin? By the way, Buckley's 2 most famous debates, Baldwin and Vidal, he lost. And Vidal says, oh, really? He says, well, Bill, he says, I think you are Mr. Myra Breckinridge. All right? And then he goes on to call him the Marie Antoinette of the American right. All this time he's needling him, and Rachel tells me I have to finish up. So that's going on in Miami. And then all the controversy and the conflict builds in the 2 conventions. And Chicago, you've actually got what was later called a police riot. And that night, that was when Hubert Humphrey was nominated, and Tom Hayden and other radicals, not as many as you might think. It was a total of only 10,000 people came to Chicago, but they protested and got into it with the police, and the police went out of control and were using tear gas. Buckley and Vidal debated again that night in the Chicago studio, and that's when the moderator, Frank Reynolds, said to Gore Vidal, well, don't you think what some of these protesters are doing, like carrying around, brandishing the North Vietnamese flag, don't you think that sounds a little bit like what Nazis would do? And Vidal and Buckley chimed in. He said, yeah, I think that's right. And Vidal said to him, he called him the only proto-Nazi in this room is you, he says it to Buckley. And Buckley lost it. All his life, the accusation had always been that he's really kind of a fascist or Nazi sympathizer. It's not true. His father was a Nazi sympathizer, but Buckley wasn't. Well, and so he said to Gore Vidal, stop calling me a Nazi, you queer, or I'll sock you in the goddamn face and you'll stay plastered. Now, Buckley was a guy who was proud of his ornate, elegant, sophisticated vocabulary. He had all 21 or 22 volumes of the Oxford English Dictionary. And one day when he wasn't looking, I thumbed through it and saw my God, he actually reads it. He knew all these huge words nobody else did, all this elegant syntax, and the words he was most remembered for was calling Gore Vidal a queer. And it actually had to be censored. Luckily, we live in a political time now where none of our public officials would ever use language like that. But in 1968, someone dared do it, and that became the thing Buckley was, for many, remembered for. And Vidal was convinced to the end of his life that Buckley really was gay, and he kept trying to prove it. And so there's a little bit of that on the book, too.